certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
According to the defence, in the case of Sarah Spiers, Bradley Edwards should be acquitted, arguing the state cannot come close to proving he was her killer. Hi everyone, and welcome to day 93 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie, Alison and Tim with you for day 4 of Mr Yovich's closing arguments. And Tim, he began the day by scrutinising the evidence in relation to the night Sarah disappeared.
Yeah, that's right, Nat. And in fact, he spent the whole morning going through all the aspects of Sarah's case, but that's where he started, because obviously that's where the story started. And he juxtaposed Sarah's last night and where she was and what time she was there and the people that she was with, who we know all pretty much gave evidence, right up to the taxi driver who was supposed to pick her up but unfortunately didn't. And what Mr Yovich did was then transpose that to the evidence that were given about Mr Edwards' movements on that night, or the night before that night, and then the morning after that night. And the conclusion that he drew from all of it basically was that logically Justice Hall should not be able to find that Mr Edwards could have committed the crime in that window between when Sarah was, or when Mr Edwards was last seen that night, which was by his first wife, his estranged wife, and when he was seen the next morning by his work colleagues in that window. They say it wasn't logical, it wasn't sensible, and it couldn't be proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he would have or could have committed that crime in that time.
Did Justice Hall have anything to say about that window?
Well, he did, yes, because when it was in a couple of aspects. He asked Mr Yovich to explain why he was arguing that in logical terms, but then he also asked, right towards the end of that window of time, if we're going to call it that, Mr Edwards went to work, and we know that from several of his work colleagues who actually remembered him being at work that day, because it was a Saturday, it was the day after a bank holiday, and it was a particular job that they were doing at Dumas House, which is quite a prominent place of work in Perth, ironically where a lot of now state government ministers do their work from. Now, one of those colleagues was quite scrupulous in taking notes about who worked and at what time, for various purposes, including overtime purposes for himself. And for whatever reason, he kept those notes for all those years and years and years. And so in those notes, it showed that Mr Edwards was at Dumas House at 8 a.m. that morning. And I think everyone in court, prosecution and defence and Justice Hall, took that evidence as being the most solid evidence of where Mr Edwards was on that morning. But then there was some discussion about what he could or would or maybe should have done if he was the killer, what he would have done after he had taken Sarah, done what he'd done with her and dumped her body, whether he would have, A, on one account, gone to his friends Murray and Brigitte Cook's house and then gone to work from there. And if he had done that, that would shorten the window, because he would have had to be in a place called Thornley at 7:30 and then be in Perth for 8 o'clock. But that evidence seemed a little bit shaky, given the really solid notes that this other witness had, which said Mr Cook had been at work at 10 o'clock on that 27th of January, which would have obviously meant that Mr Edwards and him wouldn't have gone to work together, as it was suggested they might have done. And so Justice Hall very aptly and sharply pointed out, well, if that is the case and Mr and Mrs Cook's evidence is wrong, that would have extended the window slightly. So Mr. Edwards would have had then only gone straight to Perth from wherever he was coming from, whether that be from his own house or, as one possible scenario might be, he would have come straight from the crime scene.
Right. And focusing on the night before, Ali, what did Mr. Yovich say about Bradley Edwards' movements that night, the night that Sarah disappeared?
Well, I think Mr. Yovich put it in very, very blunt language. He said, "We don't know and you can't speculate." And then he used words, very sort of appeal-sounding words like unsafe and errors if we do speculate about the movements that we have no actual facts about, both with Sarah Spiers and Bradley Edwards, only what's been told. And he said that the evidence shows that Bradley Edwards' movements that night made him unlikely for him to be responsible for Sarah Spiers' death. And it would be quite unsafe if the judge was to consider some of these details when he said, you can't fix the evidence to fit the case. And he kept hitting that. It's all speculation. We don't have a body. We've only got people's ideas of times. And he still insisted that it was highly unlikely that he would have had enough time to have done what he's being accused of. He then went further into the propensity and said this doesn't fit. 1 minute the prosecution says this guy has the propensity to do these things. Is it on the other hand? You've made him into, yes, he's a methodical, premeditated, calculated sexual prowler, but he just doesn't go off on a whim and do things, especially coming from the Golden Bay area or down south area, come up that night knowing he had an early day the next day to start work. Is it logical that he would prowl around Claremont and pick somebody up at random when he says if you use the propensity argument, you're arguing about a guy who is clearly premeditated and methodical in his dealings with taking someone off the streets.
And Tim, in this area of where Mr. Edwards was and at what time, this was when we first heard about the temperature which was submitted as part of the defence case, really the only evidence that was submitted as part of the defence case. And many people have asked us and emailed us about that. What exactly was that?
Well, that was, again, that goes back to Murray and Brigitte Cook's evidence that Mr. Edwards might have been with them before him and Mr. Cook went to work on the 27th. Brigitte Cook's recollection was it was a very hot, had been quite a hot spell. The air conditioner in their accommodation had packed up, and she remembered that Mr. Edwards had gone there to try and help fix that air conditioner. But the temperature chart that Mr. Yovich now infamously put in as his only piece of evidence said that it wasn't a particularly hot spell that day. So that's all that was about. But as we've seen, there were notes made by this other more senior Telstra employer at the time, kept very detailed notes about who worked where and when. And as it turned out today, that everyone is pretty willing to accept those as the most likely, the most solid contemporaneous note of exactly what happened work-wise around that time. And then if you go back to the start of the weekend, it was Mr. Edwards' wife's account of him coming down there to talk to her and invite her to this fireworks display on Australia Day evening, that Friday evening. And we know from some very diligent detective work done by one of the detectives in the State Library in Perth, where he looked up all the local newspapers from that area at that time, and the only likely and possibly likely fireworks display was in that area, Mandurah, Golden Bay area, and that was due to start at 8:30 p.m. that evening. So you wouldn't have thought that Mr. Edwards would have invited his wife, or estranged wife at the time, to a fireworks display that had already started. He'd been down there for a couple of hours. We heard that he'd gone down there. They had dinner with her parents. It was quite amiable. There wasn't an argument or whatever. But that invite was then rebuffed. and that around that time is when Mr. Edwards is said to have left the Golden Bay area. And so that is the window, that sort of 8:30 p.m. to 8 a.m. time stretch is when he cannot really account for his whereabouts. And that's why Mr. Yovich was at pains to stress this morning that, look, this isn't an alibi in the strict sense of the word. We cannot say where Mr. Edwards was at the exact moment, like 2:04 to 2:12 a.m. that morning, but we cannot say where he was. But we say that all the other stuff that goes around it, the fact that he had work, the fact that he'd been at Golden Bay, the fact that that he knew all these things, and he'd been separated from his wife for some weeks at that point. Why would he choose that night? That was the argument of Mr. Yovich in a nutshell. Why would he choose that night to do it? And of course, the prosecution hasn't got the so-called emotional upset evidence to fall back on, which is what they originally were going to argue around.
Yes.
That rebuff from the wife was the emotional trigger that set him off. They've abandoned that. They've discarded that. They said we're not going to rely on that anymore, and so they can't. And so Mr. Yovich can then go on and say what he said today is, well, why would he choose that night above all others?
Yes, that there's no reason for it. And in terms of, we know that night at 3 o'clock in the morning, witnesses talked about hearing these blood-curdling screams. Did Mr. Yovich raise any doubts about their evidence?
He did. He raised the doubts about which direction the screams came from, what relevance those witnesses put into what sort of a car was near the telephone box. The screaming thing was what he continued on with later on in the day with Jane Rimmer, that if his modus operandi was to gag his victims, as he had already done, or push some sort of cloth into their mouth, how were they able to scream?
Was he questioning whether the witnesses heard these screams or whether they were hearing the same screams or anything about those details?
Yes, he was questioning that. He was, we're talking about, first of all, the Sarah Spiers screams in Mosman Park. He pointed out that they came from different directions, or that's what the witnesses said. He also pointed out that these recollections came sometime after the actual events. Tim, am I right in saying that? Because there didn't seem to be any actual door knocking by the police at the time that produced this evidence.
Yeah, from memory, it was when, after Sarah's disappearance, then came major headline news in Perth that these various reports of these various screams started filtering in. But even then, when the police, we heard again today, that when the police did start investigating them, the investigation maybe wasn't as thorough as it possibly could have been. And this went to what Mr. Yovich honed in on today, was he said the most important of all those accounts was a chap called Wayne Stewart. Now, he lived at an apartment block which was off the road, away from the main stretch of Mosman Park, and it was he and his wife or girlfriend at the time heard these screams. They were loud enough to wake them up, and they happened to have a balcony, and they went out onto the balcony, and Mr. Stewart said he certainly went out onto the balcony looking for the source of these screams, given the nature of them. And what he described was he saw a car, a pale coloured car with slightly curved headlights at the back, parked on the wrong side of the road next to a phone box around about 100 metres away. This is what the prosecution have honed in on, and they say that car could well have been Mr. Edwards' car because it was similar to the type of station wagon that he was driving at the time, and that could have been the moment where it all went horribly wrong for Sarah in that vehicle, whatever she was doing in there, whether she believed she was getting a lift or whether she'd been forcibly put into that car from the spot she was in Claremont. Mr. Yovich turned that round today and said there is no way that Justice Stephen Hall could be any way convinced that that car was Mr. Edwards' car, or even that car was any way connected to the screams, because all you have is one witness hearing one thing, seeing another, putting it together in his mind, because they're two slightly odd occurrences in Mosman Park on that night. But Mr. Yovich's argument was it doesn't go anywhere near as far as it needs to in establishing Mr. Edwards' identity, because they can't say the make of car, they can't say the colour of car. He didn't see anyone that looked even remotely like Mr. Edwards or Sarah Spiers in that area at that time. So all he's done is, in Mr. Yovich's eyes, project or conflate two odd occurrences together, and then attach the significance to them because of Sarah's disappearance and what the police say, where she was going on the night she disappeared, which was Mosman Park.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting because we've talked many times about how this case is like a massive jigsaw puzzle and putting all these pieces together. But what's really interesting about Mr. Yovich's submission is he is saying none of these pieces fit, and going through these pieces one by one and saying, you see this piece? It doesn't fit. And this one here, that doesn't fit either.
Well,
that's
yeah,
right.
I mean, what he's... Yeah, go on, Ali.
No, I was just saying, and Justice Hall even pointed out they made much of the case that the car was facing the wrong way and was right next to the phone box. And I think Justice Hall was saying, or someone was raising the fact that at 2:30 in the morning, the fact that the car was facing the wrong way, but the fact that it was near a phone box made it seem like the car had stopped there for someone to make a phone call. So that was just a query raised by Justice Hall.
Yeah, and Mr. Yovich also used the logic argument in that little section of evidence as well, saying, well, if you did have a car, a young lady that you'd either subdued or were hoping to subdue, or had attacked or were hoping to attack in your car, why would you then stop at quite a prominent intersection which is well lit, that has a phone box next to it? Why would you choose that conspicuous or somewhat conspicuous spot out of all the others that you'd potentially driven past and could potentially drive to? Why would you choose that spot to then potentially do the thing that caused the screams? That doesn't bear up to any logic as well. But then, you flash back to Ms Barbara Gallo last week. Her contention to that was, well, we're not talking about potentially logical acts in the first place. We're talking about young women being snatched off the street with a sexual motive and being murdered. Trying to put a sense of logic around that might not be the right way to look at it. So, I mean, it is very interesting, the diametrically opposite poles that these two accounts are bringing out in both sides, and that they are desperately both trying to pull Justice Hall in one way or another.
That's right.
To get him to fall on their side.
And I'm just curious if, arguments today were quite sensitive around the topics being discussed, and with Mr. Yovich, really arguing that, the state has no case, that this is purely speculation. Was he quite sensitive about that, given that family members are in the courtroom?
Yes, absolutely. He did say that this doesn't take away the fact that an innocent, blameless young woman was the victim of a terrible, grave crime. But he did say that the memory of this crime won't serve justice if the wrong man is convicted, which was quite a strong statement. He said, you convict the wrong man, it's not going to do anything for her memory, and not diminishing from the actual crime itself.
Yeah, and I saw a picture on the west.com.au taken by West photographer Nick Ellis of Don Spiers leaving court during the lunch break, and I guess it really hit me at just how harrowing this must be for him today.
Yeah, it must be, because like the families of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon, Don and his wife and Sarah's immediate family and friends, they've all waited more than 25 years, or more than 24 years, nearly 25 years, for their ordeal to hopefully have some answers at the end of it. And I firmly remember when Mr. Edwards was finally charged with Sarah's murder, which was some time after he was charged with Jane and Kira's murder. Mr. Spiers put up a statement on his social media, just assuring everyone that the family was okay. They were coping okay, but they were waiting for answers. Now I'm sure today would have been the polar opposite of that. Hearing the man that is defending the man that the state says has killed his daughter, basically trying everything he possibly could to pull apart those potential answers and create more questions in the meantime. In that, if it isn't Mr. Edwards that has done these things, and who is it? And if the verdict doesn't go the way that the Spiers family hope it will, then those questions are going to remain for potentially a very, very long time.
Yeah, and I think, as you've both mentioned, that the families are very supportive of one another. Absolutely.
That's been the one thing that has struck me consistently and actually strengthened over the time covering the trial, and inevitably, the legal quarter in Perth isn't that large. There are a few cafes that we all frequent up and down Hay Street, and you're literally all walking in the same circles at lunchtime, and so you see things, and what I've seen is the Spiers family and the Glennon family, Don and Dennis, engaged in long conversations. I've seen the victims of Huntingdale and Karrakatta sharing lunch together with the police officers that have helped guide them through the trial, and the same with the Rimmer family, with Adam, Jane's brother, and a cross-pollination of all those relationships. They are obviously leaning on each other in various ways to try and get through it all. Yeah. Which you hope is some comfort, but you also wonder whether they would ever want to meet in better circumstances. Yes. They would want to meet. You're sure of that?
Absolutely. And Mr. Yovich then moved on to the night Jane Rimmer disappeared, and did he shed any light on Bradley Edwards' movements on that particular night?
Well, not as he couldn't as much as he had for Sarah's disappearance. The only thing he could safely and confidently say was that the day before, leading up to Jane's disappearance, that Mr. Edwards had played a game of softball with some friends of his, but that was as far as he could go. So that window, if you want to put it in a window, is a lot wider, and his movements are a lot less known. So that sort of half alibi or almost alibi, that isn't available for Ms. Rimmer. And we know also, and he'll come to this tomorrow, the forensic evidence, the physical evidence, in fact, on Jane is a lot stronger, obviously, than Sarah, because her remains, unfortunately, have not been discovered. So, but he began today on Ms. Rimmer's, the sort of circumstantial things around that night, including the screams that were heard in Wellard, and including the knife that was found in Wellard on the same day that Jane's body was discovered. And so those are the two main areas that he focused on. And I've got to say, I don't know if you agree with me or not, Ali, I thought his arguments against the logic of him killing Sarah were a lot stronger than the arguments that he came up with to try and throw a little bit of doubt or a little bit of shade on the case of him against Jane.
Yes, he seemed to concentrate again on the screams and whether they were the same screams heard by the two various parties. He again repeated what he said in the Sarah Spiers case, that were they indeed the screams of these victims? Were they indeed the same person? And that's what he seemed to focus on.
Yeah, and then the propensity as well.
Propensity.
So again, and then he returned to this notion that, well, the Karrakatta, the rape victim, was gagged. She was, she was encumbered. She was tied up. She was completely within Mr. Edwards' power, and that's what they've gone back to a couple of times. Whereas, obviously, if we take the screams in Wellard to be Jane, she wasn't gagged. We look at her physical injuries, including the defensive wounds, that would suggest that she was able to put her hands up to defend herself. And she was obviously taken a long way away from Perth, 40 kilometres away, whereas in the Karrakatta offence, although the drive was long, the actual distance away was very short. It was a matter of minutes away. So he's pointed to those differences and again said, well, if you want to use a propensity argument, i.e., look what he did at Karrakatta, and he must have done the same thing to Jane. Well, look, he didn't do the same thing to Jane. There were marked differences, and in fact, he used he said you have to do contortions to try and get those two cases to fit, and so he said that's why you can't be sure that the man who's done Karrakatta, done the rape there, did the murder in June '96.
Yeah, and he talked about the Telstra pocket knife that was found the same day that Jane's body was discovered. And in a way, I guess he suggested the discovery of this knife could actually point to someone other than Edwards. How did he explain that theory?
Well, he explained about the numbers of Telstra knives that are around. What are there, 4,000 or so? That this one has never been shown to contain. That people have asked about this and a contention that it's a murder weapon, but it's never produced any evidence that it was. It was tested too late or found too late, or that's always been a bit confusing as far as the Telstra knife. When the prosecution maintained it was did have the potential of a murder weapon, but if it made the cuts that the pathologists have said that the wounds were caused by this knife, surely that would have shown some sort of blood residue.
Well, according to Brendan Chapman in one of the previous episodes, we asked him this very question and he said not necessarily.
Yeah, but the bottom line is that the prosecution haven't even suggested it.
That's right.
There's no evidence about it. I mean, in fact, quite the opposite. There was extensive analysis done on that knife and nothing could be found from either Mr. Edwards or Miss Rimmer. So there was no possible way they could suggest it was the murder weapon because that would just never stand up to any scrutiny. But what Miss Barbagalla said in her closings last week were, it's a very strange coincidence that there's no particular works, Telstra works, pipes, telephone poles, anything done in that area over a long time before that before Jane's murder and then her body discovery. So why and how would that knife have got there in pretty good condition in such a sort of odd place to find such a thing, and then lo and behold, less than a kilometre away, Jane's body is discovered? The suggestion made by Ms Barbagalla was possibly it was either thrown away or it has inadvertently fallen out when Mr Edwards is committing these crimes. But then, to counter that, Mr Yovich, he went after that this afternoon quite hard and said, well, that for someone who's done that to then throw away a potentially incriminating piece of evidence is just illogical. It's outlandish was the way he described it. It would be an outlandish thing to do. And then, as you said, he went one step further than that and said, well, so if it is Mr. Edwards, there's no real evidence that he even had one of these knives or was issued one of these knives. If it wasn't his, and he wouldn't have thrown it away, then, maybe it's someone else. Maybe it belonged to someone else. And then if it did belong to someone else, well, then what were they doing in that area at that time? And Justice Hall summed it all up, really. He said right at the end of the day, he said, this is a beguiling piece of evidence because it was where it was found and because of when it was found. It's beguiling, which I thought was a particularly judicial word to use. It's an intriguing, it's tempting to look into
Yes.
it and find more than is actually.
But where does it go?
Where does it go? Where does it fit? And it goes back to your analogy, Nat, of the jigsaw puzzle. And Mr. Yovich, painting the picture of Miss Barbagallo trying to hammer jigsaw pieces in when they really don't fit. And I think Justice Hall has come to the conclusion that this is a piece of the jigsaw. He's just not going to fit anywhere in anything that's going to really help him. Yeah. But it's obviously one of those things that when we heard it, we thought, oh my gosh, there's a knife, it's a Telstra, this is it. This could be the key to the whole thing. But no, it's just going to be one of those odd bits of evidence that is probably not going to fit anywhere and probably won't be fit into any verdict one way or the other, I don't think.
That's right, and it is one of those things where you scratch your head and say, well, what are the chances? And that's exactly the point Ms Barbagallo was making. In terms of the numbers of knives out there, I think the number issued between 1993 and 1996 were 58,900 pocket knives. But if you do want to hear more about that particular evidence, it's episode 15 of the podcast, which is The Grim Discovery. So, Ali, was there any other points that you found interesting today?
Well, I found it interesting that both Mr. Yovich and the judge did talk about the way that the bodies were buried, or not buried, rather, that Sarah Spiers' body has never been found. So it's been so well concealed that it's never been found, whereas the other two were just left with bushes, maybe a branch over them, that Jane's body could even be seen from the road. Kira Glennon's was, again, just covered by shrub, enough that any people walking by could see both of them. And he brought that up only in the, issue of the timing, that the Sarah Spiers disappearance and Bradley Edwards' timing that night, that if he did do the Sarah Spiers, he must have concealed the body much more carefully so that it's never been found, whereas the other two were very, very just casually camouflaged.
That contrasted with what Ms Barbagallo had argued last week in that the discovery of Jane, and particularly Kira, she said, was almost miraculous. It's very, very fortunate for both of them to be found, particularly Kira, in that sort of sandy bush area up in Eglinton, and Jane's body, as Ali said, it was only 4 meters off the road, but it was obviously hidden well enough that it was able to lay there for 55 days undiscovered. So again, you got the two ends of the magnet sort of just pulling Justice Hall one way and the other. On the one hand, saying, well, he's got so little time and he's done apparently such a good job with Sarah that she's never been found. But Ms Barbagallo then saying, well, it's only blind luck that the other two girls were found as well.
That's right. And, there's no doubt that the discovery of both of those bodies were really the result of a, extremely unusual set of coincidences. Yeah,
well, and that's exactly Ms Barbagallo's argument in that, they might, if not for a rogue chicken,
yes,
and a bloke picking cannabis out in the middle of nowhere, all three girls might still be missing.
I think the reason that both these closing submissions are taking so long is that the questions that Justice Hall is asking and clarifying and scrutinising and analysing as we go is making this quite a long wrap-up.
Absolutely. And tomorrow it continues. And I expect, will Mr Yovich tomorrow talk about the night Kira disappeared?
He will. That will be in the morning. And then the dreaded F word in the afternoon, I'm afraid, Nat.
Yes.
That's what we will get to. That will be a large chunk of what is left for Mr. Yovich to go through. I think there was a little, a gentle little question right at the end of Mr. Yovich as to how long he thinks he might be. He said he hopes Thursday will be his last day.
Wow.
Which will be the trial's last day.
Yeah. And that really will be a marathon, closing argument. Well, thank you both very much for your time today. Alison and Tim will both be back in court tomorrow, and we hope to have you back with us tomorrow for day 94 of Claremont in Conversation. We look forward to you joining us then.
This podcast is hosted by Natalie Bonjolo, produced by Kate Ryan, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au. And if local news delivered differently appeals to you, tune into WA's newest morning show, The West Live with Jenna Clark. It's talkback radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.